It's our privilege on this lovely October afternoon in the fall of 1982 to have an hour's conversation with Margaret Byrd Rawson from Frederick, Maryland. Margaret was born in Georgia, but didn't stay there very long. Actually, she was brought up as a Quaker in the Philadelphia area. She attended the George School and was a graduate in 1923 with one of the first in their honors program, and with Phi Beta Kappa.
From Swarthmore.
From Swarthmore in 1923, her bachelor's in 1923. Then you went to the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Work. Somewhere along the way, in 1923, you were married to Arthur Rawson. What did he do?
He was an engineer, a design engineer.
And then you brought up a couple of boys.
Right.
And the next thing I have down about you is that you helped found the school in Rose Valley. And I think there might be a good beginning for why you would be on this series of Pioneers of the Orton Society.
Well, the school in Rose Valley was founded by a group of parents, of which we were part, so that we could have the kind of education we wanted for our children, the kind of education which a great many people are talking about nowadays, which was geared to the needs of the whole child. That's old hat now, but
yes.
It wasn't then. And so, since it was, we founded that school at just the right time, just at the beginning of the Great Depression. A wonderful time to start a tuition-supported school, wasn't it?
Gracious.
And so we were all working our children's way through school. My job was to run the library. Of course, I didn't know anything about running the library. Social work was my profession. But that's all right. We did anything that was needed. And since I was in the library, they sometimes sent to me children who were having difficulty in the classroom for one reason or another. There was a boy named Peter who had a great deal of difficulty in learning to read. I worked with him. I didn't know what to do, of course. Nobody did in those days, or very few people did. So I just helped him as much as I could, and it didn't do very much good. By the time he was in 6th grade, he was reading, beginning 6th grade, he was reading at about the 3rd grade level. And a new teacher came to the school who knew Dr. Orton in New York and said we really should send Peter over to him. So we did. And Dr. Orton, through one of his trainees, helped me to get started with Peter, and I went on for the rest of the year. And of course, it was a good steer. And so Peter came up to grade and went on to 7th grade in Westtown School, and eventually went on and got his doctorate in chemistry from Harvard.
You must have done something right.
I did what I was told to do by Dr. Orton. That was certainly right.
Good. Did you have the privilege of meeting him?
Dr. Orton?
Yes.
I went to New York to see Dr. and Mrs. Orton and Dr. Paul Dozier, who was their associate at that time, to find out what they had found out about Peter and what I should be doing with him and what was back of all this anyway. And so, of course, I got very much interested in the whole subject. You know, it wasn't just a cookbook proposition. It was a scientific approach to a very baffling problem. And so I had to look into that, and I read a lot of things that I didn't understand, eventually learned to understand. And so it worked very well with Peter, and I got a good deal of help from him. I was able to send children to him for diagnosis until he finally got tired of seeing me, I guess. So he said, why don't you do this yourself? You know how to now. So then I did. And but in the meantime, he had given me a great deal of help with individual children and with my study of the whole situation.
What eventually happened when you had a whole lot of boys and you had kept good records on them? What did you do with those records eventually?
Well, I put them away in the back of my subconscious, thinking that someday I'm going to do a study of ex-non-readers. So I kept some of the records, and the school kept other records. So when I got ready to do that study in 1963 and 64, the records were there. Pretty good records, considering that there was no research design involved in this. We just did it. We did what we thought ought to be done for these kids, and it turned out to have been the right thing to do for our research, too.
Johns Hopkins Press put it out, and now it is taken care of by
the Educators Publishing Service
in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Do you want to know some more about that book?
Very much,
I haven't said anything about it, really.
No, it is a valuable study because there are so few longitudinal studies about dyslexic youngsters, and yours is steeped in the scholarly bit because you went at it the right way with statistics and so forth. Yes, please tell us about it.
Well, I puzzled for a long time over how to make a useful study out of this, out of studying what had happened to these boys as they grew up. I had had a conversation with Dr. Ralph Preston of the University of Pennsylvania, who was a good personal friend of mine, saying, what do you tell the parents of teenage kids that come to you? And I found that he was hadn't felt that he could be very, very encouraging. So I told him about Peter and his PhD from Harvard and some of the others, which were just as spectacular. And he said, have you ever written this up? I said, no, I guess I've been too busy doing it. And he said, you really ought to, because parents should know this. Then I tried for a long time to figure out a way to do it. And I just couldn't get a handle on it somehow or other. So one day I was talking with Dr. Richard Masland at the Institute, and then called the Institute for Neurological Diseases and Blindness at NIH in Washington. And he suggested that I study not just the boys, not just the children who'd had language difficulties, the ones we were then, by that time, calling dyslexic, but that I concentrate on the boys, and that I study not just those boys, but all the boys who were in school for a reasonable length of time during the period that I knew them as children, and then compare the ones who had had a lot of difficulty with the ones who hadn't had trouble. Mm-hmm. Well, it turned out that the ones who had had a lot of difficulty, I knew they were going to do well, but I had not really expected that they would do even a little better than the ones who hadn't had trouble. But in the course of this, I set it up as if it had been a planned experiment, and with all the statistical frou-frou that goes with scientific research. And I had some good friends who were in the field of statistics and medical editing and that sort of thing. I had a lot of help with that book. And so it didn't turn out too badly. And it was written really very largely for parents and teachers and clinicians who deal with dyslexic youngsters, to give them some sense that these kids can turn out all right. And I didn't attempt to prove that all dyslexic children would become Albert Einsteins or anything like that, but only that as far as this very limited collection of data showed, they didn't need to fail because of their dyslexia, because none of them did fail. They all went through high school, and all but 2 of the 20 that we called moderately to severely dyslexic got their bachelor's degrees from pretty good colleges. Of those 18 who were college graduates, 13 went on into graduate study, and 5 of those 13 pulled down 6 doctoral degrees among them. One boy had 2.
Would you say he was an overachiever?
No.
No.
I would say that he was achieving up to his potential, but that we had not realized how high his potential was
Because
when he was
his
a
language
child.
difficulty was
Because
in the
of his
way.
extreme language difficulty. I would say that he was a thoroughly and completely and very successfully rehabilitated dyslexic. But I would not say that he was an overachiever.
What about the term ex-dyslexic? You said ex-poor readers. Do you think there's such a thing as an ex-dyslexic?
Well, I think dyslexia is not a disease. It's not a defect. It's a kind of mind that people have. And that I believe that it is constitutional. I believe that you're born that way. That's the kind of mind you have, and you'll always have it. You're stuck with it. But it's a good kind of mind. It just doesn't work quite the same as the mind of the people that I like to call eulexics. You know, EU for good, and lexia, again, for management of language. And I think everybody has some tendencies toward both of these ends of the dimension of what you might call lexia, you know.
Which is language, not just reading.
Yes, it includes the whole of language, from understanding and speech through reading and writing to that is reading and spelling and penmanship, to being able to write a paper or a poem or a play or however you want to express yourself in the English language or any other.
For those who call the dyslexics SLD, I know that there is quite a discussion about what the D might stand for. The specific language disability is a term that many people don't like because they don't want to use the term disabled. What term would you like for the D?
Well, my favorite term doesn't go with that collection of words. My favorite term is diversity. I believe human beings are all different. Every human being is, everybody knows who has been reading about this subject, I mean the whole subject of human variation, that there are no two human beings who are exactly alike, not only in their thumbprints, but in the way their minds work. And so the diversity, which has really strong overtones for the adaptability of human beings, and is the thing that is in back of the possibility of evolution, is the thing I like to stress. Now, when people are diverse, some people call them different. That means different from me, you know. And if it's different from me, that means if you were all right, you'd be like me and you wouldn't be different. So I don't like to use the word difference. And I don't like the word disabled, because people who are dyslexic are generally disabled because we haven't found the key to their correct, well, I hate to say treatment, because that makes you think of disease, to their appropriate education. If we knew how to educate them appropriately, as we found out how to educate Peter and Ralph and the rest of that group, then they wouldn't be disabled. So I don't like disability. Of course, there is another phrase that uses those initials, SLD, and that is specific learning disability. Now, I'm not arguing one way or another about that term. It does. The people who use it do often include dyslexics among their group, but they include other people with other difficulties which are disabling, and they don't include all dyslexics. So the two groups I sometimes think of as being under two different umbrellas, but the umbrellas are overlapping, and some kids are under both at once.
All right. As far as the diversity, could you tell us what some of the professions are, the possibilities are for these youngsters. I've read a good deal about their increased spatial ability. For instance, architects and engineers. What are some of the other professions that you could name, not just from your study?
If you're thinking in terms of spatial ability, you might think of machinists, mechanics, people who deal with the practical world, people who deal with professional things like, I think you mentioned architecture, stage design, costume design, and construction. Sometimes the ability to conceive an object includes the ability to make it. But these people, to the extent that they do have strong spatial abilities, are the ones who are able to tell you beforehand that they can see what it's going to look like when it's done. They don't just have to follow directions and come out with something, but they know what it's going to be before they start. Sometimes they can't put it into words. They say, just give me some tools.
And let me do it.
And let me do it. I know one young woman who is a cartographer. That's a good job for a dyslexic person. And there are some young women, too. She says, when people bring me reports, I say, don't bring me these reports in words. Show me a picture. Show me a model. I can handle it better in those terms. I can handle it even better if I go out onto the slopes of Mount St. Helens myself. But these people who are strong in this field, and not all dyslexics are, but the people who are strong in these fields are apt to be able to handle reality, the things that we think of as reality, because they're the things you can see and touch and hear and feel, the things you can get hold of with your senses, not just with your inner mind.
It would seem then that if this is the way many turn out, that this might be the way you would educate them.
I don't think that quite covers it. I think all people, dyslexic or non-dyslexic, have this a certain amount of this what is loosely and much too simplistically called right hemisphere ability. But I think everybody has a certain amount of that, just as everybody has a few problems with language. But and I think everybody needs to have these sides of, or this side of his personality developed through the educative process. Perhaps these children and adults can take hold of the world better if they start with this part of it and work toward language. Albert Einstein describes his own dealing with the worlds of thought in this way. He says something to the effect that first of all, he liked to see things in his mind's eye and feel them, sort of almost act them through, and only after he had things sorted out that way did he, by some long and laborious process, put it into words. Well, I've seen students in my own experience who had that same kind of approach to things. Now, I wouldn't think of teaching a person just through the things that he can do well. It seems to me that everybody needs to understand language, needs to handle language. After all, we live in a world which is full of human language. It's half of what makes us human, after all. Managing tools is the other half. And if you don't educate the language aspects of the human being, you're shortchanging him. He's got to be able to handle language and math, which is another kind of language, if he's going to live in a literate, technological world such as ours.
So we certainly teach to the strengths, but also try to develop the weaknesses.
Yeah. I would say that we help the person lean on the things that are strong and develop the aspects of his life which are not so strong, so that he will come out as nearly as possible a well-developed, well-rounded, what is sometimes called a self-actualizing person, a person who is living up to his potential. Somebody in connection with the President's Commission on Mental Health several years ago, they used the phrase learning disabilities and unused learning potential. And I think it's the unused learning potential, wherever it is, that we're trying to help have an outlet.
Which gives us teachers a real responsibility to find the proper way to help these youngsters.
Yes. Some of the most skillful teachers that I've known have been able to face a room full of youngsters, as I never could, and teach each of these youngsters in terms of the way he or she could learn best, so that when the end of the year came, they were all functioning better than they had at the beginning of the year, had been at the beginning of the year. And this is delightful. This is the way it ought to be. It's both a science and an art. And I'd like to go back for a moment or two so as not to leave the impression that all dyslexics are gifted spatial artists. They aren't. Many of them are. There are perhaps more people among the dyslexics who have strengths in this three-dimensional and actional field than among the non-dyslexics, just as there are more people who are gifted in use of language among the people who are at the other end of the scale. But these two things are really rather separate. And I've known a few people who were really language people, but who had very great difficulty with dyslexia and didn't know which end of a monkey wrench to take hold of. You know, one of my friends says that in order to redress the balance when people are always talking about language disability, we ought to have a nice derogatory word for the people who are klutzes.
Good. Getting back to education, certainly when you taught at Hood College later, when you came to live in Frederick and after you raised your family, you said that you took care of the dean's other list, where those were students, adults who were having trouble with language.
Yeah, these were college girls.
College girls.
And some of them were having a difficulty with their college work for one reason or another. Some of them were having trouble because they were majoring in boys, you know, or some of them were ill prepared or hadn't really come to grips with the fact that in college you have to work. It doesn't just come to you the way it does when you're the valedictorian in high school. But there were among the young people that I saw each year several girls who were very much in the same pattern of the boys that I had known when they were younger and that I had known in their high school years. So that what they needed was just the same, and sometimes we could give it to them. Usually the college situation was such that we didn't, either there wasn't time or, you know, there was too much to make up or something like that. But sometimes we had quite spectacular success with these girls. And sometimes just letting them know that this is what it is. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It doesn't mean you're emotionally disturbed. It doesn't mean you're lazy. It's a real thing. It's the way your mind works. And that's all right. Let it work that way. And help it to work better. But just knowing this often helps people to change their attitude toward themselves, and so that they can get a better grip on life, even even if they're adults, and in general they're making out pretty well. But of course, sometimes you find an adult who just can't read. There are quite a few of them abroad in the land. More and more we're finding all the time.
They're coming out of the woodwork, and there are adult dyslexic groups all over the United States.
Yes, there are.
And that's exciting.
This is one of the current moves, you know.
But let's go back in your own life. You certainly did a great deal of writing, and you served on the National Board of the Orton Society. You were their honorary in 1971 for the Samuel T. Orton Award. What about your writing at that time? I think you became editor of their bulletin.
When I became president of what was then called the Orton Society and what is now called the Orton Dyslexia Society, Mrs. Samuel Orton, who had been president, said the president is supposed to edit the bulletin. The bulletin was our then rather small magazine, which was endeavored to keep people in touch with each other and put in a few articles of general interest and so on. So she said, I'll help you. You've got to take it. So I took it. And I found it a fascinating occupation. I had always written a little bit, but never very much, never particularly for publication, once in a while. But now I was really committed to it, and she did give me a great deal of help. And I was the editor of the bulletin for 13 years, and it grew from being a bulletin to being what it is now called to being a professional journal, and it's now called the Annals of Dyslexia. This year's annual issue has something like 350 pages and 17 or 18 professional articles and a lot of book reviews and that sort of thing. It's really a thoroughly professional journal now. I'm no longer editor of it.
But you are the editor of the society and have a great deal to do with particularly some of the phraseology that those of us in the field have used. In fact, Linda Frank, the executive secretary of the Orton Dyslexia Society, calls you a word merchant. What are some of the phrases that you have made that you would like to be remembered for?
Well, I don't know. I rather like to reduce the things that I've been thinking about to adages or aphorisms, which may perhaps epitomize what we're thinking about, so that people may be more likely to remember them. For example, we often say in this organization and in this field that our object is to teach the language as it is to the child or the person as he or she is. And of course, this puts it into one short sentence: teach the language as it is to the person as he is. And yet it has 4 parts which are not obvious. You have to teach. You have to know how to teach. You have to know the language, because it's very difficult to teach something you don't know. You have to know how all people learn. And then you have to know what this individual person's needs and strengths and difficulties are. So there you have, in one short phrase, the text for a sermon, so to speak. But there are other phrases, too, like, well, let me see. We teach people in groups for one reason or another, but it is as individuals that they learn. We have to keep that in mind. If we don't, we get into trouble.
There was something about mastery. And
oh, yes, that's one of my favorites.
Good.
I believe that in bringing up children and in helping people with their thinking and learning, you have to have education for understanding and training for mastery. If you don't have the education for understanding, you don't know what it's all about. You do a lot of practice and drill and that sort of thing, which is a lot of waste motion. If you know what you're all about, if you know what the world is all about, as much of it as you possibly can, You make everything you do count for more. On the other hand, you have to have training in handling the mechanics of the language. Now that's easy for some people. For the people I call eulexic, they just sort of catch it out of the atmosphere. But for the dyslexic person, it often has to be taught slowly, step by step, and over again, some parts more than others. And this is one reason that after a person is 8 or 9 or 10 years old, it works much better to work with him individually, because some of the things he can do easily and you don't have to spend much time on those. Some things are inordinately hard for him and you have to spend a lot of time. But you have to have this training for mastery, and you have to do it well. You have to do it on the basis of science and psychology and all the other things that you know. You have to do it therapeutically. That is, you have to have good relationships with the child or the person, so that he or she can function at best. And so there are a great many angles to this thing, both scientific and artistic.
What adjectives would best describe the kind of education, particularly at the early stages for the dyslexic? I know one of them certainly is structured.
Oh yes, there's the
structured.
Sometimes we say it has to be structured, systematic,
multisensory,
sequential,
cumulative,
thorough, multisensory, done in a therapeutic manner, and always, as Anna Gillingham used to say, teaching to the intellect. The first of those 5 adjectives came from Dr. Lucius Waits in Dallas, Texas, and but Anna Gillingham was constantly saying, teach to the intellect, teach to the intellect.
And that certainly has been your theme song in your help in founding or at least contributing to the early stages of several schools. Could you name some of the ones that you were proud to be connected with?
Of course, first of all, there was the school in Rose Valley, which was not designed for children with language problems, but learned how to cope with those problems and made that part of its program. It was one of the first schools in the country to have a school-wide program for finding and teaching these kids.
All right.
And then there was Genesee School here in Baltimore, just outside of Baltimore.
In Owings Mills, Maryland.
In Owings Mills, Maryland, right a stone's throw from where we are now.
And it's in its 9th year.
10th year.
10th year, all right.
It's having its 10th birthday.
All right. And the next one?
And then I helped with the Chelsea School in Washington, which is designed for high school age boys and girls.
And in Richmond?
And in Richmond, Virginia, there's the new community school. In Northfield, Massachusetts, there's the Linden Hill School, on whose board I'm proud to sit. And there is the Kildonan School in Armenia, New York, and I've had the fun of being on their advisory council, as I have been with the new community school. The Trident School down in Charleston, South Carolina, is working its way toward proficiency in this field. I've visited the Armstrong School in
Menlo
Park, California, and
the Gow School,
the Gow School in South Wales, New York. And they, by the way, have just done a follow-up study of 500 of their graduates, because they've been in this business, ever since Dr. Orton gave them the start-off. And they've found that their graduates have done very well indeed.
And then, of course, there's the Center School, which is sponsored by Tri-Services Center in Rockville, Maryland. Pretty exciting. And
very exciting.
So you are still very much in the role of guru. After your own experience, you are contributing in a very active way to these other schools and as editor of the Orton Society. And I think that we also need to share that your friends who raised some money for an octogenarian trip for you rather than jewels or furs, which might be appropriate when one reaches that stage in life, that you have used it to travel with. And I think that would be a fine way for you to tell us what actually happened to those funds and what you've done in the last 3 years.
In the first place, I had long been interested in China. My husband and I and some friends and I have been very much interested in China. And so I had an opportunity to go to the People's Republic of China with a very interesting group, which was called, how did they phrase that? The mental health group.
Under Virginia Satir, which is a well-known name.
It was centered around Virginia Satir, and it was led by DeWitt Baldwin and his wife Michelle, who had been to China before, and DeWitt is a doctor and an expert in Oriental medicine.
So you
I'd also gone. I also used some of those funds to go for a third trip to Czechoslovakia, where I have many friends who are very active in the dyslexia movement, and where they have a really expert facilities, Zdeněk Maciejczak and others. And I went to England.
Where you participated in a
Where I participated in a conference on research in dyslexia. And out of that came a book to which I was privileged to contribute a chapter which I called A Diversity Model for Dyslexia, which brings us full circle.
It certainly does. You said that you were hoping that, or that you felt that individual work with dyslexics is perhaps the best way to go for them. It is not realistic in public education for it all to be individual, and certainly in the teaching field now we have developed techniques. It certainly is not as efficient, but it is certainly possible in the public schools.
It's much better than not doing it at all. And if you do it well in the beginning, you frequently catch the very large number of people who are marginal in this field, who can learn in groups. Sometimes they learn in groups even after they're older, but the best time to start with group work with people who are of the dyslexic turn of mind is when they're just beginning to learn, both as little children when they're beginning to learn to speak and talk and understand, and also as older ones when they're beginning to learn to read and write. But even after they get a little older, it's quite possible to do a great deal in groups, particularly in large public school groups, such as the ones in Renton, Washington, or
Bloomington, Minnesota,
Chula Vista, California, or particularly successful it has been in Bloomington, Minnesota, and in Wayne, Nebraska. The winds of change are blowing.
Right, Ossining, New York. Yes,
New York.
There are those places, so we wouldn't want to leave the impression that it is not possible to train in groups.
It is also possible to work with secondary school people in groups, doing a great many of the things that they need to do as secondary school students or as college or graduate students in using their language better. But they may need to have gaps filled in their skills and their understandings before they can really do as well as it is in them to do.
It seems to me that there has been a lot of recent publicity on dyslexia, a lot of it very positive, in that if there is a general understanding that it is not a made-up term and that it is a language difference and a diversity, as you say, certainly people's understanding of it is going to help them become better teachers.
I think the general understanding is much better now. It used to be that if you talked about dyslexia, people either turned away or pushed you off, and said, many people said there is no such thing, and I think there are still some people who feel that way. But if you said learning disabilities, they began to know what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Now you say learning disabilities, and they look at you, sometimes look at you a little puzzled, and you say, well, I'm talking about dyslexia. Oh, dyslexia, I know what that is. They don't really, but they've got some understanding of it. And I think the journalists, I've had any number of journalists call me and talk for a long time trying to get background in this field so that when they write articles for their national magazines or local papers, they will write with understanding and and accuracy. I think there's a genuine intent to do the thing well. There's also the fact that we have been able to simplify our statements about what is dyslexia, so that it has become much more understandable. We have one definition which I've always liked because it was given to me by a 10-year-old boy, and I've made something of it. I call him Alfred. Says Alfred, I can think okay. What's wrong is just my words. I forget them, and I can't manage them. Well, after all, what's wrong, dys, is my words, lexia. I forget them. You know how difficult it is for these kids to remember words.
Many of them have much difficulty.
And I can't manage them. I try to spell them, I try to write them, I try to say them, and they come out all wrong. So he's given us the whole thing in a very small nutshell. I can think okay. He's bright. I can think okay. What's wrong is just my words. I forget them, and I can't manage them. And that's dyslexia. There's no reason to be worried about the term. It's just that it's convenient to have a single word, even if it is in Greek, even if it is Greek to you.
So, well, Margaret, did Dr. Orton ever use the term dyslexia?
I don't think he did. I looked through all his writings while we were making an index for some of them, not very long ago, and I couldn't find the word dyslexia used even once. It had been used as far back as 1888 in Germany, but that was for a medical use. And Dr. Orton was a very interesting, many-sided person who had all the medical background that you could possibly want. He was a neurologist, a neurosurgeon, a pathologist. He had studied more human brains than anybody else in the country by the time he got to this problem. He had studied aphasia, all sorts of things. And he had also studied reading problems, what little there was written about them. There wasn't much on any one of these subjects, but if you say that science favors the prepared mind, you're talking about Dr. Samuel Orton, because his mind was certainly prepared in all sorts of ways, and he was a many-sided person in his makeup. Also very skillful in his use of language. He talked about language problems, people having reading difficulties. Reading disability was one of the words that was frequently used in those days. And he went on to talk about spelling disability and writing disability and that sort of thing, stuttering, speech problems, that sort of, all those things that have to do with language. He called them specific language disability, I'm sure. And he also invented a word which never caught on, and you'll see why, strephosymbolia, which means twisted symbols, because one of the characteristics of boys like Alfred is that they can't keep their words and letters straight. They're always getting them twisted up. So he used this symptom as the source of a coined word to describe these people. And it's a very nice word if you get used to rolling it around on your tongue, and you can shorten it up and say, oh, he's just another one of those strephs. You know. But he never did use the word dyslexia. That came into use much, much later. He knew all about the thing that people are talking about when they're talking about dyslexia, but he didn't call it that.
What about Mrs. Orton, who was his social worker in his early work?
When Dr. Orton went out to Iowa as the head of the Iowa psychopathic, or the Iowa mental health
project,
something for the state, to manage the state program and the state hospital and the whole business. The world was just at the beginning of having traveling clinics, mental health clinics, which took themselves out to the places where people lived instead of expecting people to come the long distances to a place like Iowa City, where these people were. The teams that they sent out generally consisted of a doctor, a neurologist or a psychiatrist, a psychiatric social worker, a psychologist, a public health nurse, and maybe somebody else. So Dr. Orton had one of the very first of these clinics. If it wasn't the first, it was next to it. The psychiatric social worker who worked with him at the hospital and went with him on these clinic visits was a lady named June Leidy, and she later became the second Mrs. Samuel Orton after the first Mrs. Orton died. As a psychiatric social worker, a graduate of the first or second master's degree course at Smith College, which was one of the beginning courses in psychiatric social work, she was well prepared to deal with this problem as it developed. And then after she and Dr. Orton were married and moved to New York City, she became his assistant, helping with the interviews and the testing and planning for treatment and planning for the educational development of the children whom Dr. Orton saw. Now, Dr. Orton, as I said, was a very many-sided sort of person. He was a scientist. He was a physician, first of all. He wanted to understand his patients. He also wanted to bring them help. He didn't want just to diagnose and just to prescribe. He wanted to see that the prescriptions were carried out. But he was not an educator, and so he felt that a good deal of the exact planning and the exact carrying out of the educational procedures should be in the hands of people whose business it was to be educators. One of these people was Anna Gillingham, whose name is often linked with Dr. Orton's in the Orton-Gillingham approach, which was Mrs. Orton's coinage. Anna Gillingham was a psychologist. She was perhaps one of the very first school psychologists in the country. She brought the Binet test into her school, which was the Ethical Culture School in New York City, to use not just to find out whether children had low IQs or not, because these Ethical Culture School kids didn't have low IQs for the most part. They had very high ones. But she wanted to find out more about them, and she used the Binet test and other psychological tests to study these children. She found children who had trouble with language. She was aware of them even before she met Dr. Orton. So she was well prepared to become his associate. He had many associates. Some of them were physicians and researchers, and some of them were educators, but the primary one in the educational field was Anna Gillingham. Now, Anna Gillingham was by nature a scholar, and she wrote the manual, which we all use as a sort of basic instrument.
Along with Bessie.
Yeah, she had an associate, Bessie Stillman, who was primarily a teacher. Anna Gillingham was a psychologist. Bessie Stillman was a teacher. And they had other associates who helped them to put together all the procedures. But Anna Gillingham they were students of language, and they really did a masterful job through 6 or 7 editions of this manual, which is now a big book, you know, thick. It's people are daunted by it.
Yes.
But it is a good backbone for any kind of teaching. Many people have elaborated, have tried to simplify,
Or formed a curriculum as
or formed a
Texas Scottish
curriculum
Rite,
on the basis of this procedure. And while for Anna Gillingham it was a method, for most of us we think of it as an approach, and Mrs. Orton's word for it was the Orton-Gillingham approach.
And then she started the society in his honor after his death.
Yes, Dr. Orton retired in 1948 and died after an accident. He was, among other things, he was a craftsman. He was building his own summer home and retirement home, and he fell while he was working on this house and died as a result of that accident. And then about a year later, a number of his friends and associates got together in New York just to get together, you know. And so they decided that they liked the business of keeping in touch with each other, so they formed an organization, naturally named it in honor of Dr. Orton. We tried later to find another name for it that was more, told more about what it was about. People would say, Orton? Who's Orton? But we
Only
never,
recently, as the dyslexia
only
been
recently
added.
have we found a way, just by putting the word dyslexia into it, the Orton Dyslexia Society. But there just wasn't any way of including in one name all the facets of this approach to the language problem, the understanding of language, the neuroanatomical understanding, which we're studying very hard right now. We're just about to open or to dedicate an institute for the neuroanatomical study of the problems of dyslexia up in Boston at Beth Israel Hospital.
That's your next trip.
That's my next trip.
Good.
Very next week I'm going up to be present at this this opening ceremony.
So it seems to me that another major contribution of yours is to get people together, and you certainly knew Dr. Orton and Anna Gillingham, Lloyd Thompson, who it would have been marvelous to have had a conversation with him on these tapes.
He wrote one of the best books on the subject that has been written, that is on this specific subject. He called it Reading Disability Developmental Dyslexia, and he has given us a great deal of the history of this whole concept, because it didn't spring out of the air. It was based on previous experience. Dr. Arthur Benton has followed that up with his excellent paper on dyslexia, the evolution of a concept. And a great many people have come at this both from the scientific and the medical and the psychological aspects, and from the point of view of teaching, what Dr. Orton would have called the treatment aspects.
So the identification, are you going to use medical in there at all? That the identification has to be medical? Or?
Oh yes, no, you were asking about our slokas. One that I've adapted from something that Roger Saunders started is that the problem is personal. The diagnosis or the understanding or the assessment is clinical. The treatment is educational, because it is in the field of learning, and the final understanding of it is scientific. So you can say that the problem is personal, the diagnosis is clinical, the treatment is educational, and the understanding is scientific. That boils it down to as few words as you possibly can, I think.
So there'll be lots of us involved in helping the dyslexic. Margaret, thank you so much for being our conversationalist this afternoon. You've shared so much of the history of the society and your own history. There's certainly no trouble with your words. It looks as if you're going ever onward and upward and over and are still very active in the field. We thank you for what you have contributed this afternoon to tell us about.
Well, I thank you for the opportunity of being here. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.
There's certainly no trouble with your words. Swarthmore should be proud. They knew what they were about when they gave you those honors long time ago.